We're now going to move into a discussion of the different time periods of Rome. Most of the time periods are going to be named after empire, but the first one is not. The first one you'll notice is the Republican Age, which comes from the Latin res publica, or of the people. And this time period was really related to the Senate as far as a form of government. You have no emperor yet, right? Hence, it's not an imperial period. So a lot of what happens during this period is still centered around the Senate and the Senate's decisions. And you don't have as much government propaganda, obviously, because you don't have the imperial push to create monuments for the emperors yet. So we're going to talk about a couple different things here, but you'll notice there's not as much structure as you might find in the imperial period. And so the first thing we're going to look at is patrician portraiture, mainly because I discussed the idea of the classes with you, the idea of being patrician or being plebeian, and the patricians being, of course, the upper classes, right, or the people who are going to be making the decisions culturally for the society. As I mentioned, they really are a much smaller segment, right, of the population. And one of the things that they were always trying to make very clear to the other part of the population was their lineage, right, and their background. In a sense, if you can prove your family line, they felt that that meant you could say that you were of the ruling class or of the elite class. Not a lot has changed. If you really think about how people often will try to use genealogy, right, as a way of suggesting, like, good breeding or something. You can make of that what you will. Obviously, most people sort of reject this idea. But, again, if you're trying to make a statement regarding, like, power, family line, you want to remind those around you about your lineage. And so you're looking at two different types of patrician portraiture here, both of couples, which I think is sort of interesting to consider. And one of the things I always mention with the one on the right is because the patricians were these powerful families, they often would negotiate marriages between the family lines in order to cement or further their power in a sense, right? If you had two prominent patrician families that could marry, each other, you could strengthen that power times two. So if you look at the marriage that happened here, you'll notice the man is much older than the woman, showing that it probably was a political marriage. Again, a patrician marriage based on the families and wanting to create a connection there. So, the idea of using marriage as a way of, in a sense, jockeying for power, right? The patricians really did this very, very well. Another thing you see if you look at the patrician portraits is what we call the use of verism. And verism refers to the term veristic in art. And verism, or to be veristic, is to be truthful or realistic. So you'll notice that these images have a high degree of truthfulness to them in the representation, right? Where you see people being shown as older, having wrinkles on their skin. And this is something you don't see in a lot of art. Art is usually about idealization or perfection. Go back and look at like Coffre, for instance. He looks fabulous, right? Not a wrinkle to be seen. Because art allows you to lie. And it's just like using Photoshop on a photo today, digitally rendering out those wrinkles or that pimple, right? So it's unusual in art to see realism, to see verism like this. But what we think the patricians were trying to suggest is that through age comes power, through age comes wisdom, and that each of their lines got to where they were by, in a sense, having this long-lived family with, respected elders amongst them. So where a lot of other cultures are going to erase the idea of age, Republican Romans really embraced it and said, why wouldn't we want to show this kind of verism, right, in our portraiture? And another thing you'll notice is that most of these sculptures are what we call bust sculptures. They're literally head and shoulders. They cut off above the bust line, right? So we call them bust sculptures. And again, it's a head and a shoulders piece. The reason why they were head and shoulders is that within the Roman patricians' homes, they usually would have a room with these little indentations on the wall where they would place the little bust sculptures. So you would come into a family's home and you'd look at this one wall and it would show the entire lineage of that family, like going back to, great, 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 great Uncle Claudius or something, right? It was a way to intimidate, those that came to your home. It was a way to show your lineage. Say you invited a family over and you're like, oh, the Flavians have come to see us. Oh, it's so lovely to have you. Here is our wall of ancestors. We go back 6 generations. Oh, we hear your family only goes back 3. You can see how this would be played as a certain kind of card in the patrician world. So they'd have this, display in a sense of all their ancestors. And because they were bust sculptures, they were easy to pick up and walk around with. So the patricians would actually parade them through the streets on different types of festival days and such. Again, it was a very visual reminder to the lower classes of we are in charge. We're in charge because we go back a long time within our families, and we're elite. We're above you, and we can prove it, right, by showing you these images of our ancestors. So, again, it was a little bit of political positioning. And I mentioned that the Romans, they really liked to find a way to control you, right, through either, the use of religion or the use of social class structure. They were all about political propaganda, almost on every level. So this is a very, very popular form of political propaganda. The man on the right, I wanted to mention that you'll notice he's wearing his toga a certain way. You're going to see that when we look at Augustus, we talk about the Pontifex Maximus representation of Augustus, where if someone's wearing their toga that way, we call it the toga weight, over the head, it means they were a religious person. So he probably was a priest and wanted to display that, right, in his portrait sculpture. So just a little bit of an aside there, but also something you'll see when we look at the Augustus Pontifex Maximus religious imagery. So, keep that in mind. And I love to always end our discussion of patrician portraiture by showing you this sculpture. First off, it's unusual because it actually is a full-scale, piece, a lifelike piece of the man. But notice he's also holding the portrait busts of his ancestors. So it's an unusual little piece in a sense, because normally you wouldn't have a full-scale sculpture, a life-size sculpture. It's not part of the tradition as much. But the fact that he's holding these portrait busts, it really brings everything together and make you think about how they actually use these portraits in the patrician families to suggest, again, their lineage, their power, how long they've been around, all those kind of great things. The other side of the coin of discussion for us in the Republican era is the city of Pompeii. As I mentioned, there's not a lot of political stuff yet beyond the patrician portraiture. The architecture is a little bit limited here as well. So the other thing I always like to show you in Republican Roman art is the city of Pompeii, because it is like a time capsule, and it gives us a sense of how the Romans lived, both the elite and the common people. And, it's kind of just this thing, almost like a bug stuck in amber that you can look at. It's like a little time capsule, because Pompeii was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius. Also, its sister city, Herculaneum. So you know the story of these cities, right? Pompeii and Herculaneum both were destroyed. I'm not going to show you anything from Herculaneum, but again, you can always go there and look a little bit more, right, at Herculaneum and investigate a bit, of that city too. But I choose to just focus on Pompeii. So what happened was Pompeii and Herculaneum were both very wealthy cities, primarily what we'd probably call like second home towns, for people who were very wealthy. So the patricians that lived in Rome, they would have perhaps like a country villa, here in Pompeii, where they could escape to, in a sense. This would probably be like their second house. So we don't think a lot of the people of Pompeii were like primary residents. It was mainly like a getaway for the wealthy. What occurred was Mount Vesuvius, when it started to erupt, people didn't know what a volcano was. We talked about this a little bit back with, Çatalhöyük. Like, they didn't know what a volcano was. They, probably thought the gods were angry or something. But people basically didn't leave. They kept staying, even though the volcano was erupting and ash was falling and different things were happening. And finally, when they realized it was, far too late, most of them were struck down by toxic gas and were killed where they were. So one of the archaeologists who came through in the late 1800s to work here at Pompeii one of the things that he did was he started to like notice these depressions, and he began to question, what am I seeing? What are these little depressions as I'm excavating down through these layers? And then he said, let's pour some plaster in these depressions and see what we're working with here. And they began to find that they were the basically the indentations of the people who had died there. And so as he poured the plaster in and they took the molds apart, they began to find these very haunting images like the one you see here of people who were killed by the toxic gas as it came through. So as this figure sort of crouched and has their hands up to their mouth as if they can't breathe because they couldn't. We find mothers huddled over children. We find dogs still, tied to posts in the ground. It's a very eerie place, Pompeii, because you're walking around through this dead city where people literally died in the midst of their everyday lives. They were panicked at the end, but really up until the final sort of moments, a lot of them didn't know what was happening or why they should leave. So sometimes people are like, why didn't they run? It's like, well, they didn't really understand what was happening to them. So what you have is kind of the bones of this working city stopped in time. And as we sort of walk around through, we can get a real sense of the everyday lives of Romans. What did the support staff of the city have to do to keep the wealthy happy? They had to wash their clothes and make their food and all these other things. But we can also look inside the homes and the businesses of the elite. So it gives us a really good idea of like how Republican era Romans lived, especially the wealthy. On the left, you see a common Roman villa. And I'll show you a diagram in a second to give you a sense of how these homes really worked and why they were really ingenious and interesting. And on the right, you'll notice a cloth dyeing business. So you'll notice there's this pit, this vat kind of in the middle of the floor. And that's where they put the dye, right, in, and they would put the clothing in, the cloth in, and they would use it to dye. Now, my fun fact about the Phalanca, or the cloth dyeing workshop, is that Romans actually used urine in cloth dyeing to help the colors set. And so the colors would be more strong and vibrant and vivid. So the story was as people were walking home from the pubs or the bars or whatever you want to call them, they'd been out drinking in the streets and were heading home, especially the lower classes who wanted a bit of money. The Phalanca workers, the cloth dyers, would stand out in the streets and pay people for their urine. They'd be like, come on in, pee in the vat. So, I never sort of turn away from a hilarious story about, this kind of thing. And it's funny if you think about it because they're paying these common people for their urine, their pee, to make the color set faster on the clothing that's probably being sold to very, very wealthy individuals. So, again, it's just a funny class commentary story. But again, you can go through and kind of see the bones of the city. Now, how were most Roman villas set up? So the wealthy people who lived here, what did their villas look like? Here's the plan from the House of the Silver Wedding, a famous Pompeian home. And what you will notice right away is that there are not a lot of windows to the outside world, because this was a city, so they were sort of packed pretty close together. It was, a metropolis. And so there wasn't a lot of space to work with. So you didn't really want to have these elite people looking out and seeing people on the street passing by. So what they did, you'll notice, is create openings in the ceilings to create the airiness and the openness and the airflow that they wanted. But windows, there's not that many of them. They created, again, these areas where the light and the water, right, could come in from the ceiling. If you go back and look at the last slide, you'll notice the pluvium in the middle, where they'd catch rainwater, and they'd use it in all kinds of different household activities. So the pluvium would collect the rainwater, and then they could use it. So again, they really tried to have a very insular, inside-facing plan, right, to their homes. What they did to eliminate the idea of claustrophobia is they painted these beautiful murals, these fresco paintings on the walls. So here you're looking at one from the Villa of Livia. Livia will be Augustus's wife, so we'll talk about her later on. This is actually not from Pompeii, but I just really like the painting, and it gives you a good sense of a lot of the things you'd see in a mural painting. And I chose this one because I wanted you to be thinking about how, because they didn't have any windows, how could they emulate nature or fake nature in their homes? I'd mentioned before that the Romans were very into faux-ness and fakery if it suited their needs. They didn't think things had to be truthful. They weren't like the Greeks in that way. The Greeks were like humanistic, innovators, and they thought truth was important. Romans didn't. Romans were like, who cares if it's the truth? Does it work? So to them, creating a painting like this, right, where you're faking nature in a sense to give an idea of nature, they'd be like, well, sure, why not? It doesn't really matter. It gives you the idea of that. And this is a painting from Pompeii that I also wanted to show you of the husband and wife. And I wanted you to think about, with this painting, how people would try to use fakery and faux-ness and how they might represent themselves. So if you're decorating your villa, you're going to put things in the villa that, are nature or some kind of, displays of entertainment to make your home look beautiful. But you might also have some renderings of yourself, right, or your family. And again, just because it's you doesn't mean you have to be entirely truthful. So we found that a common type of portrait was the type of portrait you're seeing here. You see it a lot in Pompeii, Herculaneum, a lot of Republican, areas, right? You see this portrait. And you'll notice that the people in it are holding two different things. They're holding a scroll, and then they're holding a wax tablet and a stylus. They're holding these implements because they want to suggest to you that they're educated. The scroll implies that the man can read. The wax tablet with the stylus implies that she can write. So they're trying to, with their portrait in a sense, tell you we are educated people. Like we, are elevated not just in our status as patricians through the wealth of our families and the lineage of our families, but we're also educated as well. And if you wonder how a wax tablet works, basically you warm it up so the wax becomes kind of soft, and then you can use the stylus to press into it to write messages. And you'll notice that it's like a hinged tablet. You could then shut the tablet and send your messages off to whoever you were trying to communicate with. But this is a way of trying to say we're educated. Now the funny part is we know that probably only about 10%, 15% of the population was literate at this time, a very small segment. But we find tons of these portraits, which leads art historians to basically come to the conclusion of like, well, somebody's lying. But that's the beauty of art, in my opinion. That's the beauty of representation involving yourself. Most of us aren't very truthful. We have a good side, right? Someone's taking a picture, we're like, oh, no, my good side, right? Or, make sure you're putting the camera up high so I look elongated, right? There's all these tricks you can do. You can Photoshop something out. I don't want that there. Take that out, right? Or, oh, I hate my pimple. Take that out, right? My favorite is just the open lying that often people do, especially with social media, where, they'll pose with a car that's not their own, or like, a purse that's not their own, and put it up on social media, and people are like, I know she does not have a Louis Vuitton, come on now. But it's all this sort of idea of social positioning, and a lot of people try to say this is a new thing, like the social media, this is a new thing, right? I'm like, no, go look at the husband and wife. We've been doing this kind of posturing for a very, very long time in order to represent something that perhaps isn't quite true, right? So it's interesting to consider that. But again, you have to also look at Pompeii to see how people were representing their families, representing their relationships, and it's really interesting. One other thing I think you can see in this portrait is that the people come from two different regions of the Roman territory. The woman seems very Mediterranean. She seems very Italian. She has lighter skin. And then the man looks very Egyptian. You can go look at what we call the Fayum portraits. And they are portraits that come out of the Egyptian region during the Roman period. And in the Fayum portraits, they look just like this man, darker skinned, right? So again, one of the things I think you can see that's really interesting here also is that you can get the breadth of the Roman Empire through who these people are, their backgrounds. And I had mentioned before that many patricians would marry based on what kind of deal they were trying to cement, whether it's your line is powerful, or perhaps here, maybe this man was from a family that traded grain, because we know that in Egypt they were supplying a lot of grain to the Roman Empire through their connection to them. So maybe her family's like, well, they have a really, important grain industry, and we want to be a part of that. So you're going to marry off to him, and we're going to have that connection through that marriage. So there's a lot of socio-political positioning you can see in all these images, and I always think it's pretty easy to consider. Next, we're going to move on to the imperial period, and you're going to notice that the art's going to be very different because it's going to focus mainly on the emperors and their political agenda, and then what gods and goddesses they were favoring. So it's going to be a little bit different moving into our imperial discussion.